Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar here today. I'm delighted to have you all here in person and those who are online. Hello from the GDI Hub Lab. Today we have a very special guest, Pranay Arun Kumar from RMIT Australia. He's doing his PhD there in biodesign, basically the design and development of medical devices. And today he'll be touching upon some of his experiences and research work related to the development of medical device and how it overlaps with assistive technology. His research work is particularly focused on wearable equipment and wearable devices for diabetes. But today he's going to present us a bit more general overview of how design and practice in this particular sector works and how it overlaps with assistive tech. So with that, over to you, Pranay.
Thanks, Tiggy. Thank you all for joining. Yeah, so I'm based in Melbourne, and my current research is on diabetes and wearables for diabetes. But I've worked over the past 8 years in healthcare in general, including projects with Tiggy on assistive technology and healthcare policy and service development. Today, I want to talk about the practice of medical device design and what would be, I'm trying to reflect on my own experiences in practice and research to then come up with an understanding of what is good practice in this field. So I'm not presenting research as a set of findings and new knowledge. I'm rather presenting research as a way that can lead to discussions and deliberations on what is the practice of medical device design. So a little bit about me. So I have an undergraduate degree in industrial design, which I got in 2015. Following that, I dived into medical device development, and for about 3 to 4 years, I was working with small and medium enterprises in India, developing surgical devices, assistive technology, and wearable diagnostics. From there, I got interested in the sustainability aspect of medical devices and the environmental impact. So I got the opportunity to do a research master's at the Royal College of Art in the UK. So I spent 2 years over there, understanding what are the sustainability implications. Then the pandemic hit. I moved back to India and continued my practice and continued to develop medical devices, but with a new understanding of how my practice is not only affecting the patients or the users of these devices, but also the environment in general. And from there, over the last 2 years, I've been based in Melbourne pursuing a PhD, which is more focused on wearable devices for patients with diabetes. And so a lot of these experiences, both in practice and research, have led to new questions emerging on how we're developing devices. So the traditional focus of medical device development is always patient-focused and patient-centered. We look at devices as a way of improving health and reducing disabilities for any and every individual. However, through this practice, not everything is actually patient-oriented when you actually develop the device. So for example, this is a surgical device which is used to relieve patients of chronic sinusitis. So those who have chronic sinus issues, this is a surgical device which helps open up the sinuses and prevent them from a chronic blockage. And this was developed in India as part of my undergraduate final degree work, and then it went on to into the market 2 years later. And in the traditional biodesign approach, one would look at what are the existing devices in that market and try and see how can we position a product which is more beneficial both to the patient, but also meets a market requirement. So for example, there were existing procedures and devices which were costing anywhere between 50,000 rupees to 150,000 rupees. And we had a novel approach which reduced the cost to 25,000 rupees. That was the main agenda. How do you bring the sinus surgery process lower in cost and hence more accessible to people? But then there are other factors that we then started including. If the cost had to be low, we needed to make sure it wasn't a device which was used in an operation theater, because operation theaters can cost a lot. We had to make sure that the patient is not admitted to the hospital overnight, because that's another cost. And thirdly, we want to make sure that there are no post-procedure requirements. So normally, any sort of surgical procedure will require medication and further treatment. So we wanted to see what are the ways in which we can minimize all of that. But all of this is looking at the patient and the context in which this device is developing. However, the way I got into the project is I was introduced to a provisional patent that the company had filed. And so there was a patent. The company had come up with a new way of doing things, but they wanted to realize that into an actual product which could be used in the real world. And so my job was to take the product from the provisional patent to a market ready product. And that is a very different, the way we explain this product is very different, because we say, okay, fine, this is the user need, and then this is the product that has to be developed. However, the way we actually work in these systems is, where is the gap in terms of IP? Where is the gap in terms of technology? And then we try and bridge that gap with a new way of doing things. And so in a very similar approach, I went on to develop 3 more devices. There was a low-cost smartwatch for monitoring cardiac variations, basically arrhythmia for patients over the age of 60. A low-cost device to prevent neonates and babies from getting pneumonia right after childbirth, and then a low-cost device which can help clear out the eustachian tube. The eustachian tube lines the ear canal with the nasal canal, and so when you're flying by an airplane, your ears get blocked. It's that tube which gets blocked. So all of these devices had the same process. We came up with a novel approach to doing things, filed a patent, and then went about trying to develop something which can actually reach the market. It wasn't, this is a need in a hospital, let's try and make something for that. And most of my practice has been in this approach. And we even went on to, I co-authored a book on inventing medical devices with one of the collaborators with whom I've been developing these products. And there's a clear focus on IP, which determines whether your product can actually reach the market. If it can't reach the market, then design exercises around that product are merely academic. So what I found through this process is that the actual medical device development process is not patient-centered, it's more patent-centered. We find gaps in technology, we find gaps in IP, and then try and bridge that. And you could use this process in any industry. The question is, why is this the approach when we know that so many people are struggling with health issues? This is the first part. The second aspect of what I went on to do at the RCA and my research after that was more about the environmental impact. So the NHS, the UK is a very good example because there's a lot of data associated with the environmental impact of medical devices. So much of my research from 2018 to 2022 was in determining what are the environmental impacts of medical devices, why are they happening, and what are potential interventions to reduce them. So the challenges that we found were, one is, we know that medical and non-medical equipment account for almost 1/5 of all carbon emissions from the NHS. Most higher education programs till the pandemic had no focus on sustainability or environmental impact. They also did not have a focus on regulatory frameworks. And so when you teach someone how to develop a device, it was all about the engineering and the technical aspect. It was never about what are the minimum risk and safety requirements you need to keep in place. The government does not endorse any standards associated with eco design or improving sustainability metrics. And when you actually develop medical devices, you know that it's all about quality management. It's all about the existing international standards and meeting those standards. So the actual process is very different from what we learn or what we are taught to believe is the way. And then when we map these processes all the way from innovation in medical devices to what is actually happening in hospitals. So most of the waste is incinerated or landfilled. And that's not that's part of the system. So the system promotes incineration and landfilling because it's a much safer way of dealing with things. You don't want pathogens to reprocess. And so the risk of recycling anything is much higher than just chucking it in the landfill. So it's not that the government is not perverse. The system is designed to minimize the risk to the patient, but that does not factor the risk to the environment and the risk to all of us. And we know this is a big problem because we now have microplastics in our drinking water. We have nanoplastics in the air. We're breathing all of this. So the broader impacts are not being considered. And the regulations are also designed, as I said, to support minimum risk to the immediate user of the product, but not to the broader community where this product is being used. So all of these devices that I mentioned earlier, these were developed in India, but these were not developed for the Indian regulatory landscape because India did not have regulations till last year. So every medical device that I developed with teams in India was designed for CE certification or FDA because that's the gold standard. And when you get a product certified by the European Union or by the US, you can bring it into India much more easily because clinicians are much more they have much more faith in the FDA and the European market. And so there was no conversation about going through Indian regulations. There was no conversation about meeting Indian requirements. There were no requirements. And that's also the case in Africa, in Southeast Asia, in South America. Most countries outside of the US, Europe, and Australia don't have regulations. And if they have regulations, they're being built on the backbone of existing frameworks from the FDA and European Union, which means if the European system or the US system is not promoting better use of resources, more efficiency, and reducing carbon emissions, it's just going to follow through with all of the Southeast Asian countries. And then you have, I mean, India is the biggest population in the world right now. You have most of Southeast Asia has huge populations, right? So the per capita emissions due to healthcare are going to be much higher than what we already see from the US, Europe, and Australia. And that's something that has yet not even entered the academic sphere. So this made me realize that, again, the conventional model of patient-centered design in healthcare is actually very, very planet decentered. It's not easily focusing on the environmental impact. And we know that recently there's been much more talk about sustainability, but all of that was because of the pandemic. When I was doing this research in 2018, there was no talk about sustainability in healthcare because the focus was on fashion. Fashion was the big issue. Fashion was where brands like Burberry were burning piles of uh, fast fashion goods. And there was no funding in environmental impact. Now, tomorrow we have a workshop which is looking at sustainability in wheelchairs and repair. So because of the pandemic, there's more focus on this, but we're quite late in the whole argument. And we're already seeing that much of the effects are being dealt with by the global south. Europe has started in creating these conversations. They're not really trickling down because the regulatory frameworks are not actually adopting them. Most environmental impact management is voluntary, even in the UK. So a medical device company um, can can say that they're measuring all their environmental impact and they're quantifying it and they're trying to reduce it. There's no regulation that mandates reducing environmental impact. And that's just going to go forward with countries like India, China, Vietnam. The third thing is there are opportunities to reduce environmental impact, and we can see them with new technology, new ways of doing things. data is at the center of innovation now, and data is one way of making systems much more efficient. If we can quantify the effects, we can potentially reduce them. And so there are enough, we can look at technology, and it's particularly in a lab setting like the GDI hub, there are opportunities to create new innovations which can reduce the overall environmental impact. And because a lot of the work that this lab does is with low income countries, that innovation mindset and culture can then go through to countries where no regulatory framework exists. But then there are downsides of data as well. So we know that more and more healthcare is leaving the hospitals and traditional silos and entering into our home environments. We have more wearable devices. Most assistive devices are owned and used by us. So it's becoming personal. And so the data associated with it is also becoming personal. We know that most of the companies that trade in data, so you have all of these social media firms and Google and stuff, there are no regulations to what they can do. The GDPR only protects the user, but it does not condone the impacts produced by the manufacturer or the company. So data protection laws are very, very low and very ineffective. We don't know where that data is going. I was informed last month that my medical insurance company had a data leak in Australia. All that data is now in the dark web somewhere. I have no idea what's happening with it. The company was only was asked to inform all the users whose data was lost. We still don't know what's happening to that data. What steps are they taking to fix it? Nothing. And then we have other issues with data. So when you have your Apple Watch telling you your heart rate, if it suddenly tells you you have a heart rate of 200, you're going to get anxious and your heart rate will increase, regardless of whether your actual heart rate is 200 or not, right? So when data enters our personal lives and we start using our personal technology to determine our own health outcomes, we have various people will react in different ways. Some people are very productive with a lot of data in their hands. Some people develop hypochondria. So it doesn't work the same way. And there are no regulations to determine how should this data be communicated to users. A lot of healthcare research is now using Fitbits and Apple Watches. They're not medical devices. They're not designed to take medical data. But the research is using them because technologically, these devices are much more advanced than any medical device equivalent. But all that data is going back to them. And because technology is moving so rapidly and the regulations are keeping up, companies are just using these devices because it's easier to get it done. A Fitbit costs you $50 and you can do anything to do with heart rate monitoring, accelerometry, whatever. An equivalent medical device, something that I'm using in my research, costs upwards of 200, 300 pounds. So it would, as a PhD student with a limited budget, I'd use a Fitbit. I'm not going to buy a professional medical device because I'm already seeing that everyone else is using it. So clearly nobody has an issue. The clinical community doesn't have an issue. Then we know that a lot of our health data is also being monetized. So the health data collected by Google and Apple is then being traded with other companies and they're making money out of it. And that is leading to fear mongering. So the advertisements you get through Google and through Amazon are designed to tell you that you're ill and you need a new device, which they provide, right? So the data is moving around in very weird ways. And now our design processes are more geared towards what is the data gap? How do we use that data gap to create a new device? So again, patient-centered design is moving towards data-centered design. The user is left out. We're looking at what is the gap. And in this case, we're looking at where is the data lacking or what data do we already have? How do we use it? So my current research through the PhD is looking at physical activity monitoring for patients with diabetes, which is very data heavy. It's very technology driven and the regulations are very scarce in this. So clinicians don't know how to prescribe physical activity to patients. It's as simple as that. If you walk up to a clinician and say, what do I do about physical activity? They will say, go for a run, join a gym. Joining a gym, we all know, does not translate to physical activity until you actually use the equipment, which very few of us do. So most clinicians, and I'm working with a clinician for this research, he's very adamant that I don't know what to tell patients when they come to me and say, I'm not working out enough, what should I do? All they can say is, then you should work out. That's useless advice. And so one way that we're trying to solve that issue is, what if we can quantify movement and give that information to a clinician? So then the clinician can say, okay, you have 100 units of movement on an average per day. Maybe we can push that up to 120. That's the way clinicians work. It's also the way nutrition is prescribed. It's also the way medications is prescribed. You give them a number, they'll increase the number and say, now do this. But it also works in some ways for patients, because if a clinician were to tell you go running and you don't like running, you won't do it. If a clinician were to tell you that swimming is a very good activity for you, but there's no swimming pool near your house, you won't do it. So a lot of my research is looking at what are ways in which we can prescribe physical activity without being specific about the activity itself. Can we convert physical activity into a number which you can follow without actually having to do a very specific activity? You could just wave your arms around, and technically that is physical activity, but it's not being quantified by any of the devices we use today. So we're trying to come up with a way of doing that. But more relevant to what I'm presenting over here is, because we're going to develop this wearable device, which will then quantify physical activity, we're trying to now apply some of the ethical principles that, or the ethical questions that are coming up, and figure out what is an alternative way of doing this. So what if, instead of patent-centered design, we looked at open source design? It's not a new concept. Open source software is something we're all using anyways. It becomes tricky when you have open source hardware. And although I could put up all my design files online today, that is not a regulated medical device. Until you produce it, run it through quality testing, through batch manufacturing, it's not a medical device. But this way, we prevent the sort of IP mongering thing. We prevent people from just creating more IP with no use for it, and protecting intellectual property, which could potentially be used in different contexts. So we're trying to create a device which is open source, and then figure out whether that is one way of improving access to medical devices. Instead of a planet decentered design, what is a planet centered design in medical devices? So we're looking at, when a product is open source, maybe I developed the device in Australia and I put up the files online on GitHub, and your lab can print the device using the 3D printers you have, get a PCB printed, put it all together, and use it here. So we save the cost of transport of that device, which you may otherwise would have had to buy from Australia. But we don't know what are the actual implications of this. So this is something we're testing out now. And then the third thing is, all these devices that we have today, the money that the companies make is not on the device. The money that the company makes is on the data, right? But what if you as a patient could own that data? If the device you use produces data that you have on your system, and you decide which clinician to show it to, you decide who actually sees that data, who has access to it. It's again something that is not yet in the industry. It's not being practiced anywhere. So these are completely sort of blue sky approaches that we're trying to work on, and come up with a way that would change the way medical device design is practiced. And because we're developing a very simple wearable accelerometer based device, it's not so complicated to use as a case study, but then it also doesn't prove a lot of, say, wheelchair design. How would this sort of approach translate to other medical devices? All of that would be further research, but it's an entry into focusing on the ethical aspect of medical device design, rather than just the ethics of the research involved. So yeah, I just explained what we're trying to develop is a low-cost, clinically prescribed method of long-term continuous monitoring of physical activity with activity-independent periodic goals for progressive engagement. I'm not going to go too deep into, well, I'm not going to go into my PhD research today. The idea is to sort of put this as a question to everyone in this panel, in this talk, and the audience. This is sort of my understanding of some of the ethical gaps in medical device design, but we all have different experiences because we're all doing work in the same space. So how would you define good practice in medical device design? I'm going to leave you guys with that question. Hopefully we can have a conversation on that. Thank you. Yeah.
I was going to say, oh, I don't know if they can see me. Thank you so much for joining. That was really excellent. So I wonder if we got any questions. If we have any questions from the online audience or anybody in the room at all? Let's have a look. Oh, we have a question from the room.
Let me know when they're ready to go.
Yeah, go. Do the question, and then if you wouldn't mind repeating the question so the online audience can hear clearly, that would be wonderful.
Yeah. So a couple of questions. I'll try to just sort of roll into one computer screen. I was really interested in your discussion of sort of how there's a lack of regulatory framework surrounding use of data and like automated aspects of medical devices. So I'm wondering how you think something like the EU AI Act would impact upon the medical device design process or realm. And sort of related to that and your question around wanting to bring in patient-owned data, I think that's amazing. I think that's one of like the core things that we need to be thinking of in moving forward with any kind of technological advances. But I'm wondering how you conceive of like so that sort of like shielding data from being in international organizations who sort of evade or in that like regulatory gray areas. But I'm wondering, have you thought about or had kind of discussions around also shielding that data from potentially being let's say summoned or requested by governmental or national actors, say for something like disability benefits determinations, and wanting to think about like, oh well, let's see how active this person actually was, and then that becoming streamlined into how do we determine a cutoff point of which someone who's under a certain threshold can be considered sufficiently disabled to access benefits, versus if they're over a threshold they would lose or potentially not be allocated as many benefits as they might be entitled to. So sort of safeguarding from the sort of allocated harms that we're now seeing, specifically using AI. That's just something that came to mind. And then I'm also just really curious if you have had conversations or how has it come up for you factoring in something like gender in device design in terms of looking at like differences in physiologies, preferred like expressions, aesthetics, things like that.
Okay. Thank you. Let me try and break it down. I think there were 3 questions over there. The first is, what is the role or what is the implication of the EU AI Act in medical devices? So I think that the simple answer is right now, for example, there are some AI-based softwares and devices in the US. There's an author called Eric Topol who's written a book called Deep Medicine, which is all about the use of AI in healthcare, and it's from a US setting, and US is it's a whole other problem. But the problem with AI right now is the data. So if the data is open and transparent, then one can track back to a certain extent what was the decision tree behind a certain prescription or a certain treatment program or a certain outcome, whatever that result is. When it's machine learning, it's a little more straightforward. But when it's sort of generative artificial intelligence, then it gets murky. And that's where AI as in itself may not be a clinician. AI will have a supportive role. Right now, the companies which are using AI have not disclosed any of the data sets that they're using, which is a problem. If you don't know how that data has been used, how the model has been trained, you don't know what outcome it generates. And we've seen that in commercial devices like the Tesla cars hitting people from with dark skin, and then devices not detecting people, etc., etc. I'm not really clear about what the EU AI Act does and how it makes individuals or companies liable in case of malpractice. And I'm guessing at this stage, even they don't know what to do. But machine learning, on the other hand, is something we can still, if you establish what classifiers are being used, what approach is being used, what is the pre-trained model, what is the data set, there's some level of sort of there's some level of transparency in what model was used. And I think this also speaks to your third question, which is the gender. So if we knew that a certain AI model was trained on whatever, a certain number of people with a certain diversity in demographics, gender, sexuality, whatever that be, then there's legitimacy to the model. And so whether it's accurate or not, that's a different question. But we know that the manufacturers had certain say in what sort of an audience was used. The problem is companies will never be able to give that information because there are ethical connotations to how much information of a participant can you disclose to the public. So I think the way EU is trying to go about this is asking these companies to give them the data sets so that the regulatory body can sort of go through the data sets and decide what's happening. But it's still going to be a pain. Like the way I'm trying to work with accelerometer data, I'm collecting data at anywhere between 50 to 150 hertz, which is 150 lines of data in every second. How would you expect a regulatory authority to deal with that? So we need AI models and machine learning models to parse through existing data sets to then figure out what sort of way has it been trained. It's a complicated mess, and I'm not clear about what EU is trying to do, but other countries still haven't figured it out. So that's one or two parts of your questions, but I'm happy for you to ask again. What was the second question?
It was around how you would envisage like safeguarding that use of
Yes.
data from governments who necessarily would think that they have legitimate interest in that data and can exert powers in order to, gain access.
So there are some precedents to that. I think Estonia has a blockchain system which stores all of the citizens' healthcare data. And the way it works is the citizen has access to that data and they can authorize access to certain clinicians. But the data is stored in a government server, which means the government is the custodian of the data, but the data is owned by the patient. And that does create a lot of there's a fine line between ownership and custody. If you don't have custody of your data, then what can you do with it apart from see it? If you own that data, how does that translate to storing or physically, tangibly keeping that data? It's not clear yet, but it does depend on how individual governments work. So even Switzerland, the government owns healthcare data, but they don't act on it till it's authorized by a caregiver or a patient. And so you as a patient or your caregiver can authorize certain ways in which that data is shared with clinicians. It's still a model that's evolving, and I think it's easier said than done. And there are lots of ethical considerations. Like, for example, we did interviews about diabetes data with clinicians in Australia. And some of them were pro patient ownership of data because they said the patients would have better agency in dealing with their own health, particularly because diabetes is a long-term condition. So you have you can potentially have huge data sets collected over a period of 20, 30 years. There were some clinicians who said that patients should not own their data because if they have an adverse event, they would be liable because they did not share the data or they did not appropriate the data in the right way. Because then you're saying that patients can be their own doctors. The fact is, most of us are our own doctors till we go to a clinician. And nobody makes the government or any other organization liable for us falling ill ourselves. So right now, healthcare is still a sort of reactive system. It's on us to be proactive about our own health. When healthcare becomes proactive, for example, public health starts warning you about your potential to develop disease over the next 10 years, then the system changes and then new issues come up. So it's not clear how patient ownership of health data materializes. So we're looking at a very small case study of physical activity data, because that's still not as dangerous as, say, heart rate data or medication data. And we want to start with that as a case study and see what happens when patients own their own physical activity data. The same way you know how many steps you've taken every single day. But in this case, we're saying you own the raw data, which means you can do whatever analysis you want on it and you can share it with whoever you want. It's not clear how this materializes, and there's probably no way of finding that need. So the way we're doing it is a design-led approach where we create a system, we give patients their data, and then we see how do they react to it, because that will tell us what are the behavioral implications of patient ownership of data. So yeah, so that's an evolving thing. I'm not very clear yet.
Yeah, really interesting. We have some online questions, so I shall just read out the first, which is from Albert, one of our researchers that wasn't able to join us today, but has joined us online. Thanks for joining us, Albert. Albert asks if there's a way to make quality assurance for open source physical devices more understandable and easier to use and perform in a distributed manner. And there's a second part to the question. So since you're good at answering multiple questions, I'll give you another section related to the test. And or can new standards be made for open source hardware devices?
Okay, so the first part of the question, there is some work already happening. There's a project called the UBORA project, UBORA, which is looking at open source medical devices. They launched a textbook last year. It's from a lab which is based out of the University of Pisa. I can share the link with you, and essentially they focus on quality management systems and how do you maintain quality management systems for an open source sort of repository. And the fact is, it still comes down to the manufacturer. So the digital repository has no clinical relevance. It is simply a space where a 3D model and a program is stored. It's only when that is translated into a physical object and produced in batches that it can go through a QMS system and then go into production and be used. So the UBORA project is very interesting. It's been developing over the last 5 years. It's an EU-funded project, and they've been working on figuring out how do you make open source medical devices legit, essentially. What are the regulatory implications, and how do you get, what are the, particularly the economic implications. So if I were to provide my device online, what would I sell, and should the sales be purely for the manufacturer, in which case a very philanthropic model, or can the data set or the device sort of design, can that be a commodity in itself? There are different ways in which people are trying to explore that, but most of it has been philanthropic so far. So the first question was about the QMS. So I'm not an expert on QMS, but I think the UBORA project is a very good reference. The second question, clearly I'm not good at this.
Oh, I thought you've answered it, so I felt it was quite clear. But the second question was, can new standards be made for open source hardware devices? Okay,
so there's the Open Source Hardware Association, which is trying to figure out new standards, but that's for all open source hardware projects. It's not limited to medical devices. I've gone through the existing medical device standards, which are applicable in the EU and in UK. And once you take the product into production, I think the standards sort of apply in the same way. But if you're talking about the standards for publishing the documentation, that is an issue. So one of the problems that we are facing right now is we have found some open source medical devices which we're trying to prototype in our lab in Melbourne. And yes, the design documentation is extremely diverse. The softwares they use are diverse, the data sets are diverse, the metrics are diverse. And so that is a huge pain to just collate and put together. There's probably a way of doing that, but the problem is technology is moving so fast. A device developed 10 years ago was using 4 different softwares, and today it's using 4 very different softwares. And each of those softwares was made by a corporate organization which wants to protect their own unique format. And so the format changes. And so we're completely reliant on the most dominant system. For example, whatever, Altium for PCB design. Now all design files, if they're Altium, then that's great. But there are open source alternatives which are just not able to keep pace with sort of IP protected systems. If this whole concept of open source medical devices moves forward, just like other sort of software, open source software projects, I think it will eventually emerge, like new standards will emerge, which will have backtracking, which will have ways in which when you develop and the components you develop doesn't matter and the original sort of the essence of the product remains the same. But it's difficult to say that, like even with sensors and the components that we use, they're changing every year, and they're often not, like one of the products we're trying to make has a flash memory which stopped production, and now we need to get a new flash memory, which means we need to get a new program. We need to program it differently, so we need another skill set. That is something that we're trying to work on through this project, and I probably don't have a very clear answer to that. I'm sorry.
No, that's great. We have one more question from our online audience. It's quite a long one, so settle in, everybody. Here we go. So first of all, amazing talks. I think we'll echo that. But I wanted to ask if open source design becomes more predominant, and from what I'm aware, these designs don't require regulatory certificates and be classified similar to how Fitbits are classified. How can we be certain these designs are accurate or safe for patient use? Would regulatory bodies require to make certification for open source designs? And if so, would this increase the cost for producers, and therefore the open source design may require a paywall to fund the cost of licensing?
That is potentially one way of doing things. As I said earlier, most clinical research is now using commercial devices as is. So although we're not clear about the algorithms used, we're not clear about the data sets used to train AI models, they are being used because there is clinical relevance to the data coming out from these devices. But the Fitbits, Apple Watches, Whoop, whatever these devices are, they clearly state that they are not medical devices, and the data produced should not be used in a clinical context. And if you do start fiddling around with your health because of certain data, the company is not liable. Essentially, that's and one of the things that we found with activity trackers is that you have a spectrum of these devices now, all the way from Instructables and DIY projects to Fitbits and Apple Watches. The hardware is practically the same. So it's all about the code, which is a black box, so we don't know. Which also puts into question, if the hardware is the same and potentially they're equally accurate, then why is there a huge cost difference? And that cost difference is because of the way they were developed and because of the resources put into the development. Most of these Instructables projects were created by 2 students in a garage or something like that. Which begs the question, if we've democratized design so much, where students and everyday sort of enthusiasts have access to the same resources, and we're producing objects which have the same sort of validity in terms of the data outcome, why are regulatory processes so expensive? And you're right. Is it really needed to go through those regulatory processes in order to get your device to the market? The only reason you would want to do that is without that, you would lose out on a certain audience. So a hospital would not legally get one of these devices in their inventory until it has the UKCA mark or the UKCE mark, the CE mark. So, which is why Fitbits and Apple Watches, they don't cater to the medical community because it's not a big market for them. It's only when the market becomes relevant or the use case becomes relevant. For example, the use is within a hospital setting. That's when getting through that regulatory framework is important. But for example, for assistive devices, it's possible that you don't need to have any of that paperwork and they're still being used. We know that a lot of assistive devices are being used without having a medical device certification. And patients are probably benefiting more because they're much cheaper to buy. So so there is this question of where is this medical device industry going, particularly when healthcare is coming home, when all of our products are now available to us and we don't need to be in a hospital to use them. It does change the dynamics of the industry, and maybe the certification system is redundant when everything comes home. Yeah, I don't know.
Okay. Thank you. Are you ready for more? I feel like we're giving you a grilling, but it's just really, really interesting. And I think a lot of areas that have a lot of crossover, a lot of the work that people across the Global Disability Innovation Hub and some of our wider programming and research areas are really focused on and exploring quite a lot of detail at the moment. So, we now have two questions. There we go. So first one, are there any promising business models for open source hardware? So a bit more description on that says, given the changeable nature of some medical conditions and the technology may be service-based or personalizing hardware devices based on aggregated patient data.
Yeah, okay. So yes, there are, the projects that I've seen so far, which are in the market, are mostly from philanthropic sources. Like even the projects that I've developed, which are open source and sort of free to use, are typically through organizations like the Red Cross, WHO, etc., where they're not concerned about who makes money from this. And that model does work if you have deep pockets or you know someone with deep pockets. Is it a profitable venture as of now? Really depends on the kind of device and business model you have. I've been struggling to make a product which can make a profit where the design files are not relevant. The IP creates a huge barrier. And also you can't open source everything. For example, if there is an IP protected system, you can't just create the same system and say it's open source. Most of the medical device ecosystem is now pretty chock-a-block with IP restrictions. Companies like Johnson & Johnson and Medtronic, they've made enough IP rather than enough products, and they've just taken that whole market and protected it. And so it's very difficult to even get a product with novelty now in the market, which is why a lot of the open source innovation tries to go under the radar without going through regulatory issues at all. Whether there's a profitable way of practicing this, I'm not sure. It's something I'm trying to explore. Again, the Ubora project has a few projects that they've actually implemented. Most of them have been implemented in Africa. I don't know whether they're going through a philanthropic model or they've actually created a business. There's one company called Glee, I remember, which was a doctor in Syria wanted to develop easy diagnostics, 3D printable diagnostics for use in the refugee crisis over there. And he partnered with a Canadian firm to produce these devices, and they've put all their design files online, free to use. But again, they say that the design files themselves are not the medical device, and so they're not protected. You need to produce the device, have a notified body see your batch production, and only then it goes through. production. But they have to do this because they're developing diagnostics which are used in a clinical setting. I would think if you have an assistive device or something that is used at home, it might just be better to go through sort of not medical device regulations, but just regulations to say the electricals are safe, the magnetic, whatever is the radiation levels are safe, things like that. And you could still get the product in use. Either way, whether you go through medical device regulations or not, you're still liable if you're saying that the data has to be used in a clinical context. But yeah, it's an interesting space and it's still emerging. I mean, this textbook came out last year. There are very few projects right now in the world which have successfully created a business out of it. Most of them are philanthropic. So I'm hoping you are the one to come up with a case study that we can all use. Yeah, that's where I'm at.
Wonderful. So we're nearly towards the end of the session. We've got one more question. Don't know if you've got enough stamina for one more.
Sure.
Why not? We might just ask you to stop your unplug your laptop with the screen now. I think you've finished the presentation, and I realised when I stopped your screen share, people in the room had you in double format, which is wonderful, but might have looked a bit funny for people joining online. Hence the double human. So the final question is, if open source devices are being used in clinical practices, if a use error occurs, e.g. the patient is injured by the device, who is at fault? It's a big one.
The manufacturer. It's not the person who's created the design files. It's the person or the company that manufactures the device, because they are liable for the actual quality of the product being produced. So that is a risk, which means that as a manufacturer, I would want to vet the design documentation and make sure that it's up to standard before I use it. So it's probably, the good thing about open source is it can be contextualized. So if I design a device which is more suited for Australia and I put the design files online, there might be a better use or a different use suited for UK, for Europe, for Asia. And so that design can be modified and then used, or it can be used as is, but there needs to be some credibility, and that credibility can only be proved through prototyping and batch production. So which is why the existing open source devices that are there, the manufacturer is very closely linked to the design team. So the team which is producing all of that information to make those devices typically has a liaison with the manufacturer to make sure that everything's on track. But yes, the manufacturer is liable if a product, if there's any sort of negligence or malpractice, and where the product is responsible.
Lucky we put into half past because I now have 3 extra questions. Two are related to what you just said. So I think you showed a lot of interest in this topic. And then we definitely got one more from the room, which we'll maybe wrap up with. So in terms of related to what you just said, a follow-up question was, what about the accompanying software? Can't say that word. And then another question around that. So about the accompanying software to the product, and who is liable if a design infringes on a patent? The manufacturer, user, or designer?
Again, manufacturer. So if you read the medical device regulations, everything goes back to the manufacturer. The one who produces the device is responsible. I see the quandary around open source softwares. So the assumption here is the software is in a format, say on a GitHub repository. It has to be installed by someone to be used. So the producer of that software would typically be liable. And so it really depends on in what format has the software been provided. Like, for example, if the software is a set of zip files put together, it's not really a software then, it's a software when it actually works. And typically these softwares would go through a notified body and they would have to go through a QMS. And so you would need to show whether each individual software and the patches are working. And so I actually don't have that much experience with softwares, but I'm guessing that would be how it works. So, but it's interesting. If the software is on an open source repository, who is liable? I should probably read up on that.
Excellent. So we'll now go to our question in the room. Emily, talk speak nice and loudly.
Yes, thank you for your talk. It was really interesting. And I'm not going to ask you about open source design. I was actually interested in the planet-centered design that you mentioned. And I wonder how accessible that is for the different socioeconomic areas of the world and how you kind of see that possibly going forward or taking that into account.
So when it comes to sort of the environmental impacts of medical devices, the best way to reduce emissions, so most of the emissions that we find through LCA softwares are to do with transport. And the fact that we have this globalized supply chain where products are being produced in different countries and then assembled somewhere and then brought somewhere else, that is the biggest issue. And so when you localize production and consumption cycles, you significantly reduce the impact, which also helps build a local economy. The problem there, although that's very that's something that can be done in developed countries, in underdeveloped countries with no regulatory frameworks, it's a problem. So it does come back to regulations. And then if you need your device regulated in the UK or in EU, then you need to show them the notified bodies over there, and then you need production batches over there. And it's not the best model right now. And we've tried to do that in some of the projects I've done in India, which have then gone to Africa. There are no local regulatory bodies, there are no notified bodies, and so there's no, you can't actually even focus on the environmental impact. There was a project that I did 2 years ago it was a research project on prosthetics repair. And so in India, there's one company, which is a government-funded company that produces upper limb and lower limb prostheses. The users are typically low-wage laborers who live in rural, sort of remote communities. They buy a prosthetic device, and then their work is so sort of manual labor, those devices wear out very quickly. We found that they had to travel somewhere between 300 to 500 kilometers in order to get repair done. And we sort of estimated the costs. The cost of travel, staying overnight in a big city to get the repair done was much more than the cost of the device itself. And so some of these individuals, rather than repairing devices, they just bought a new one. So the cost factor completely eliminated the environmental impacts, or rather any focus on the environmental impacts. So I feel like even when we talk about climate equity, to expect low-income countries with no regulatory framework to live up to the climate targets is unreasonable and potentially very discouraging. And they tend to rebel more when you say it's your fault. However, as I mentioned earlier, when the regulations in EU start factoring the restriction on hazardous substances, that came into the regulations in India as well. So all of these developing countries are just waiting for the regulations to emerge in the US and EU, and then copying them. Until developed countries like in Europe and US don't stand up to change their ways of producing and consuming medical devices, there's very little hope of it translating in lower income countries. So it's nice to be in Australia.
Wonderful. So we have about 30 seconds left.
I'll just say yes or no.
Yes or no. Actually, I think we're going to pause the questions there, otherwise we will still be here come midnight. There's a lot of queries and questions coming in, so apologies for anyone who we didn't get to the questions to online and in the room. Thank you so much for joining us. Really, really interesting. As you hear, lots of interest and yeah, a really important area. So thank you for sharing all your research. If people want to know more or see more about your particular research or the work you're doing in your PhD or anything like that, is there any particular place they should look?
Yes, I have a website.
Okay.
And I have an email.
That's good. So what I think we'll do is we will share your website if everyone who joined today who are interested in knowing more.
I can put it in the chat right now.
Yeah, if you're happy to, that would be wonderful. Pop it in the chat. And then we'll also send via email after the session along with the recording, so that if anything can catch back up. So we'll probably wrap up for for that. Thanks coming through from the people joining online. And
Thank you so
yeah,
much.
thank you so much for joining us today. And yeah, I look forward to hearing more.
Thank you for your time.